Tonight, we begin with a development that tax experts had feared, warned about, and quietly prepared for. A rule that unfolded not over years of gradual enforcement, but in a single tax season. A single season that left thousands of retirees staring at unexpected penalty notices. A single season that drained retirement accounts that took decades to build. A single season that turned what many thought was a bureaucratic formality into a financial emergency. What the IRS did this year crossed a line that retirement planners had hoped would hold a little longer. And when that line broke, the agency did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and zero tolerance. For several years now, there had been whispers, not official announcements, not formal policy memos, just whispers, that the IRS was preparing something significant around required minimum distributions. The agency had been patient, yes, but they had been deliberate in their patience. Their enforcement moves had followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a predictable cadence. But what set off alarm bells in tax preparation circles this filing season was that the warnings went silent. Financial advisors who monitor IRS bulletins and penalty enforcement know the indicators. The quiet update buried in the Federal Register, the revised Form 5329 instructions with new language, the softening of penalty waiver approvals, the sudden drop in automatic relief letters, all of that went quiet. And whenever the IRS goes quiet on penalty enforcement, it means something is about to get very loud for taxpayers who weren't paying attention. Early in the 2024 tax filing season, tax professionals detected what they described as a sharp uptick in IRS penalty assessments, including enforcement actions on retirement account holders that had not been pursued this aggressively in over a decade. These are the kinds of enforcement moves the IRS only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a shift in enforcement priorities, a tightening of compliance standards, or a deliberate message to the retirement community. Tax professionals didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the IRS was changing its posture on RMD compliance. And when a federal agency shifts enforcement posture without a loud public announcement, even by a small measure, every financial advisor in the country pays attention. The $10,000 penalty, technically a 25% excise tax on the amount you failed to withdraw, was no longer theoretical. It was being assessed, it was landing in mailboxes, and retirees were caught completely off guard. The penalty notices issued by the IRS this season were not routine. They were not symbolic. They were not the kind of soft reminders that come with easy waiver options. They were urgent financial demands, and they were arriving in the homes of retirees who, in many cases, had no idea they had done anything wrong. Enrolled agents and CPAs speaking with financial publications described the IRS's enforcement shift as aggressive, unprecedented in recent memory, and, perhaps most importantly, technically airtight in its legal grounding. The agency was not overreaching. They were enforcing a rule that had existed for decades, one that millions of Americans had simply never been told about clearly enough. But confusion only works as a defense if the IRS is willing to show mercy. This year, that mercy became harder to obtain. In fact, the penalty waiver process that many advisors had relied upon for years became significantly more restricted after 2023. Within a single filing cycle, tens of thousands of retirees found themselves facing assessments they couldn't simply appeal away. These weren't minor clerical errors. These were systematic failures to take required minimum distributions, failures that, under current law, carry one of the steepest penalties in the entire tax code. Tonight, let's be precise about what the IRS is enforcing and why it's catching so many people off guard. The required minimum distribution rule requires that Americans who hold traditional IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, and most other tax-deferred retirement accounts must begin withdrawing a minimum amount every year once they reach a certain age. Under the Secure 2.0 Act, that age was adjusted. It used to be 70 wanted to, then it moved to 72. Now for those born after 1950, it has moved to 73. And for those born after 1960, it will eventually move to 75. These changes confused millions of retirement savers. Many assumed the rules had changed entirely. Many assumed they had more time. Many assumed their financial institution would handle it automatically. They hit the wrong assumption on all three fronts. They hit the belief that a higher RMD age meant no obligation. They hit the misconception that the penalty had been eliminated. It was only reduced temporarily from 50% to 25% and then to 10% if corrected quickly. They hit the gap in communication between account custodians and account holders that left retirees without clear instruction. In other words, the IRS is now targeting the infrastructure of ignorance, the combination of legislative change, administrative confusion, and financial institution silence that made non-compliance almost predictable. And understanding that fully, they are assessing penalties with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but systematically. And here's where the story becomes even more striking. Tax policy analysts now believe the IRS's enforcement push was designed to test whether the retirement community understood the implications of Secure 2.0 after years of regulatory flux. The agency wanted to see whether retirees and their advisors would remain passive in the face of new rules. Instead, the opposite happened, but not before real damage was done. Financial advisors who had been educating their clients were protected. Those who had been passive were exposed. CPAs speaking with retirement journals under anonymity described the IRS's approach as a compliance stress test, a way to identify weak points in the retirement planning ecosystem. What was revealed is that a shocking number of Americans over the age of 73 are either unaware of their RMD obligation or are calculating it incorrectly. They are not criminals. They are not tax cheats. They are people who received complicated legislation presented in simplified headlines and assumed they were fine. That assumption is now costing them up to $10,000 or more per year in penalties, and in some cases, for multiple years of non-compliance simultaneously. As reports continued coming in throughout this filing season, we learned more about the true scale of the problem. Custodians at major brokerage firms reported a notable increase in clients calling to ask about RMDs they had missed, some by multiple years. Tax software companies flagged thousands of returns that included retirement income inconsistent with required withdrawal schedules. Financial planning associations reported that RMD-related penalty questions became one of the top 3 client inquiries nationwide. This wasn't just a paperwork problem. This wasn't just a miscommunication between an agency and its taxpayers. This was a systemic failure of retirement financial education. This was the consequence of policy changes moving faster than public understanding. And public understanding is the one thing the IRS cannot legislate, which makes enforcement the only tool they have left. Remember, many retirees thought the 2019 Secure Act had simplified everything. They thought the CARES Act waiver of 2020 meant RMDs were optional indefinitely. They thought Secure 2.0's age change meant they simply had more time, with no strings attached. But tonight, the exact opposite is unfolding. The rules are stricter than they've been in years. The penalty waivers are harder to obtain. And the IRS is no longer in the business of assuming good intent without documentation. What makes this moment so painful and so financially dangerous is that the IRS's enforcement push happened at a time when retirees are already under extraordinary economic pressure. Fixed-income households are dealing with elevated costs of living. Healthcare expenses are consuming a larger share of retirement budgets. Social Security adjustments are not keeping pace with real inflation for many households. Into that environment, a $10,000 penalty, or a string of them, is not a minor inconvenience. For some retirees, it represents months of income. For others, it forces early liquidation of investments at unfavorable valuations. For all of them, it represents a failure of the system to communicate clearly and a failure of the financial industry to close the gap. The IRS's enforcement posture, now reflected in updated penalty assessment data, was designed to signal that the agency is not willing to allow broad RMD non-compliance to become the norm. Officials have stated plainly that failure to take required minimum distributions is inconsistent with the terms of tax-deferred account eligibility. That is bureaucratic language for, you accepted a tax break for decades. Now, you must follow the exit rules or pay the price. You don't usually hear that level of firmness from the IRS unless the scale of non-compliance has crossed a threshold they can no longer ignore. Meanwhile, certified financial planners addressing their clients this season have delivered unusually direct messages. One prominent retirement specialist put it plainly in a widely shared briefing: "The era of grace periods is over." Another said, "If you are 73 or older and haven't confirmed your RMD with your account custodian, you are already at risk." And a third said, "This is not a mistake you can easily correct after the fact. The window for penalty reduction is narrow and closing." These are not rhetorical warnings. These are statements from professionals who understand just how high the stakes have become for a generation of retirees who did everything right, saved diligently, invested wisely, and are now at risk of losing a significant portion of that effort to a penalty they never knew existed. Analysts are now identifying several categories of retirees at risk. One group is those who turned 73 in 2024 and assumed their first RMD wasn't due until April 2025. Technically correct, but dangerous if the second RMD then stacks in the same calendar year. Another group is those managing inherited IRAs, where RMD rules change dramatically and remain deeply misunderstood. A third group, the one worrying advisors the most, is those who have multiple retirement accounts and are calculating their RMD from only one, unaware that aggregation rules apply differently depending on account type. The good news is that today, action can still prevent or reduce the penalty. Contact your account custodian. Calculate your RMD using the IRS Uniform Lifetime Table. File Form 5329 if a penalty has already been assessed, and attach a letter of reasonable cause. Act before the current tax year closes. As this tax season continues, we expect more details to emerge about just how many retirees have been affected. But what we do know is that the IRS's enforcement action was not without warning. The warnings were simply too quiet, too technical, and too buried for ordinary savers to find. It exposed a dangerous gap in retirement financial literacy. It revealed the cost of assuming that someone else, your broker, your bank, your financial platform, was managing this for you. And it delivered an expensive lesson about the importance of knowing the rules attached to the accounts you've spent a lifetime building. And tonight, for the first time in years, the retirement planning industry appears to be listening, really listening. The calls to financial advisors are rising. The questions are becoming more specific. And when retirees start asking the right questions, it means they are paying attention. It means they are taking ownership of rules they were never clearly taught. Because tonight, a generation of savers learned something they should have been told from the beginning. The tax break was never free. The rules were always attached. And the IRS, patient as it has been, does not forget. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ignorance of the RMD rule is no longer a viable defense. The penalty is real, the enforcement is active, and the time to act is now, before the next notice arrives in your mailbox. We will be here, watching every update as the next phase of this story unfolds.